Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to play a short video while we're waiting for others to join in.
All right, here we go.
Plastic island on the ocean, plastic island on the sea. How did it get there, man? How could it be? It's the plastic thrown away by you and me. It's made of cups and bags and many things. It's mostly high density polyethylene. This island just might kill our seas. And if it does, we cannot breathe. There's a plastic island on the ocean, oh yeah. Plastic island on the sea. How did it get there, man? How could it be? It's the plastic thrown away by you and me. Man, single-use plastic ain't the key. We gotta stop using it, people, please. Or maybe we could all just move to Plastic Island. Man, sounds like a dumb idea to me. Man, there's a plastic island on the ocean, right? Plastic island on the sea. How did it get there, man? How could it be? It's the plastic thrown away by you and me. Then one day our children will say, ain't no more plastic in the sea. And all them fishes can swim so free. Plastic Island's ancient history. I hope Plastic Island's ancient history. I hope Plastic Island's ancient history. Yeah, there's a plastic island on the ocean, right? Plastic island on the sea. How did it get there, man? How could it be? It's the plastic thrown away by you and me. Plastic thrown away by you and me. It's the plastic thrown away by you and me. Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Addie. I love that video. I love the music. I love the visual. I love the message. Everything about it is wonderful. So with that, we will jump in and begin our presentations. This is being recorded, so just be aware of that. We will be sharing it out through social media after the event. So if you want to keep your cameras off for any reason, feel free to do that. I'm Janis Jones, and I am going to do a brief presentation and introduce our special guest today. Let me see if I can share my screen. Oh, let me get back to the beginning. No, stop. There we go. Got it? Can you see it? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I went through a whole presentation, almost the whole thing one time, and then somebody told me I wasn't screen sharing. So I always have to check right off the bat. So here we are today talking tiny, a conversation about microplastics with Jenni Brandon and Tammy Russell. two scientists who are not only knowledgeable on the subject, but can convey the information in a way that makes it accessible for everyone. So I'm so excited to talk with them and learn from them today. I am Janis Jones, and that's me drowning in plastic. That's an image that I created with a photographer friend, Margaret Boyson. I'm a Surfrider Foundation Rise Above Plastics co-lead. I'm an educator in Oceanside, and I'm a compulsive beach cleaner and maker. And I currently have an installation on display at the Hill Street Country Club Gallery, which is in the Linksole building in Oceanside. And it has been an honor and a pleasure to be able to bring my work to this audience. But I also wanted to highlight Addie from the Reuse Project. It was started with a group of Cal State San Marcos students who wanted to bring awareness to the plastic pollution problem. And they also had done a great installation at the Hill Street Country Club and have become partners with the gallery in raising awareness about plastic pollution and other issues. Here is an image of my installation during a family event that we did there. And in the music video, he was singing about a plastic island. And these pools of plastic on the gallery floor are meant to replicate or represent rather the garbage patches that are throughout the ocean. There's one in the North Pacific that people are most familiar with, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. There's also one in the South Pacific, the North Atlantic, the South Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean. And in some ways, these pools of plastic on the gallery floor, they're meant to raise awareness about the existence of plastic throughout the ocean, but they misrepresent it in a way because I think what we're going to learn from Tammy and Jenny is that the proliferation of plastics in the ocean and throughout the environment everywhere are really microplastics, and they're not floating islands of large pieces of plastic. These are examples of microplastics or breaking down into microplastics that I have found on North County beaches, Carlsbad and Oceanside. It's prevalent here. People think of it as being a problem in other places, but it's very common to find here, even in Carlsbad and Oceanside. And right here is a bottle cap, and then you can see all these tiny bits. I think this is mostly polystyrene bits, styrofoam bits that have broken down, but you can see the tiny bits of it there. And then this is a piece that I made that's not in the gallery exhibition, but I wanted to share it today since we're talking about microplastics. I wanted to represent the fact that it breaks down into smaller and smaller bits. And I called this piece Infinity and used the infinity symbol as a way to show that it's here and that it's not going away. This is going to be an issue that we're going to have to deal with. So with that, I want to introduce Tammy and Jenny. Tammy is a PhD student at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and she's a NOAA Nancy Foster Scholar. She studies microplastics in the Antarctic and looks at the impacts to seabirds. And she's also a volunteer for Beachcombers and works with people to survey beach birds and marine mammals. And then Jenny has her PhD from Scripps Oceanography, and she also focused on microplastics. In fact, she was the first to find microplastics in the temporal sediment record, and perhaps she can explain that to us. She's a passionate science communicator, and she's currently a senior scientist at Applied Ocean Sciences. So with that, I think that Jenny, Tammy, who is going to go first here?
I'm going to go first and just give a brief overview of marine plastics, and then Tammy's going to talk a little bit about once those marine plastics interact with some animals. So let me share my screen. Oh, someone has to give me permission to share my screen.
All right, you should be good now.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. So let me, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about microplastics in general. I'm not going to go too much into my own research, but I'm happy to talk about that afterwards. So I like to call microplastics the ocean's biggest tiny problem because they're really hard to see. Most of the time when you're in the ocean, you don't even notice they're there. But the more we sample for them, the more we're really finding them all throughout the ocean. So if you start at the very beginning with the history of plastic, plastic is a relatively new substance. It's only been around for about 150 years. So the very first type of plastic is celluloid. It was made out of cotton and camphor. It was made to imitate ivory. So way back in 1860, we already knew we were killing too many elephants and we needed an ivory substitute. We still haven't really learned that lesson. But because celluloid was made out of cotton, it's what we would today call a bioplastic, and it actually naturally biodegraded. The first fully synthetic plastic was made about 110 years ago called Bakelite, and that was made out of coal tar. And that was also made to imitate ivory. It's that bottom picture. It was often used for things like billiard balls. And then in the 1920s and 1930s, they started to make synthetic plastic using petroleum. And these are the plastics you know today. So things like PVC and polyethylene, they were making them in the 20s and 30s, but they weren't very popular. They were kind of like chemistry experiments. They really weren't very commonly used until World War II. So in World War II, there's kind of this plastics boom. As the war happens, we send metal and glass and rubber and silk over to the war, and back here on the home front, we need to replace those things. And so a lot of plastic factories are built quite quickly, and there is this plastics boom in popularity during the war. The war ends, all these plastic companies don't want to close, these plastic factories don't want to close. And so there is a very concerted advertising effort after the war aimed at Americans, and specifically aimed at American housewives, that plastic is going to make their lives easier. And so this is an ad in a 1955 issue of Life magazine that says, "Throw away living, disposable items cut down household chores." And look how easy their lives are. You know, they're throwing their plastic plates and cups and forks. They're never going to do the dishes again. Their lives are so easy. And this is really where single-use plastic began in the 1950s, right after the war. Styrofoam is invented in 1954. And this is kind of where plastic is off to the races. 1950s. By the 1970s, Scripps scientists find plastic in the middle of the subtropical gyres, what we now call the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So very quickly, this becomes an ocean pollution problem. And it wasn't until 1989 that MARPOL Annex 5 is passed, which is a huge international law that banned plastic disposal at sea. So before 1989, any size vessel, including like huge cruise ships, Navy destroyers, anything, they were throwing all their trash overboard, including all their plastic. And that's because people didn't really know what plastic was. It was so new that they didn't realize that when they threw it overboard, it wasn't going to biodegrade like everything else. You know, they were throwing bones and fish scraps overboard that would biodegrade. They were throwing aluminum cans overboard that would just rust away. They didn't really realize that the plastic they were throwing overboard would last forever. So plastic today, you see this kind of exponential curve start right after the war, and it's just gone up and up and up. Today, there's around 407 million tons of plastic produced annually worldwide. That number is now already out of date. There's an estimated 4.8 to 12.7 million metric tons of that plastic that enters the ocean every year. So, you know, we make 407 million tons, and roughly about 8 million tons of that enter the ocean every year. And there's an estimated standing stock of 5 trillion pieces of plastic just floating on the surface of the ocean currently. That's just what's floating on the surface. And it depends which scientists you talk to that just like we all have different opinions as to what percentage of plastic floats versus how much is below the ocean. But some people say that 5 trillion pieces of plastic is only 1% of the plastic in the ocean, and 99% is lower, is below that. So how is all this plastic getting into the ocean? It's actually mainly getting into the ocean from polluted land sources. So these top 2 pictures are polluted rivers. So the top picture is actually one of the very first pictures. If you Google Great Pacific Garbage Patch, this picture is going to come up a million times. That is actually a polluted river. He is not canoeing in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And then that top right picture is my friend Travis in our local river system. So that is the Tijuana River National Estuarine Research Reserve. In September and October, it is almost always dry, and you can go help clean it. And that is what the bottom of it looks like when there's no water running through it. And so here in San Diego and Tijuana, our trash flows right out into the Pacific Ocean through our very polluted river system. So the estimate is that about 70 to 80% of plastic in the ocean is coming from land sources, very polluted rivers, harbors, beaches, and then the other 20 to 30% is being disposed of at sea via shipping and fishing accidents. But those estimates are like all very rough. And then these bottom 2 pictures show something that's actually rather intuitive, which is that places that are very populated make more trash. So if you see in Europe, you know, cities that have a lot of people have more microplastics in their sediment. So we've really started to see that places with more people make more pollution right off their coasts. So how does this plastic get out into the very middle of the ocean where no one lives? What happens is if you're here in San Diego, you drop trash into the San Diego or into the Tijuana River, it flows out into this current system. So it gets in where it says California, that's the California current, and it gets into this clockwise current system that is what's called a gyre. So if you've heard of these things called the gyres, 5 gyres, that is not a trash term, that's a physical oceanography term. And so what happens is all the water in the ocean gets spun into these gyres. That's actually how the whole ocean recirculates. And it pushes all the water to the center, to this area of the map that says convergence zone. And it's always been doing this and kind of moving the water to the center. But now that there's all this trash in the water, it's converging all this trash to the center of the North Pacific also. And so here in the center of the North Pacific, where it says convergence zone, there's all this trash. And then these 2 red areas are kind of the densest areas of trash. These are what we call the 2 Pacific garbage patches. And then this white box in the middle is poor little Hawaii. They kind of like lost the geological lottery, and they're right in the middle of the garbage patch. And then all my research went from kind of focuses on San Diego to Honolulu. So I really focus on this Eastern Pacific garbage patch. So when you go out there to the Eastern Pacific garbage patch and kind of envision this gyre in your mind, this is what a lot of people think they're going to see, is this floating island of trash. You know, sometimes people think that it's so thick we can't sail through it. They think it's so thick they can walk on it. In reality, it's not like this. Luckily, this is not what the middle of the Pacific Ocean looks like. It's not this dense, and hopefully never will be this dense, but these pictures are places on our planet that are this polluted. These are just all more near shore. So as you can see in that middle picture, you can even see a city skyline. So these are just really polluted coastal areas that do flow out into the ocean. But by the time it gets out into the ocean, it gets a lot more dispersed. So when you're out in the middle of the garbage patch, it's actually a whole lot of blue water. And And when you get out there, you're not even really sure. You're like, did we make it? Are we here? Are we in the garbage patch? Like there's no sign telling you you're there. But when you're there, you're like 4 days from land in any direction. Like you are in the middle of the ocean. And then you start to see tires float by and bleach bottles float by and all this trash float by. And what we really started to realize in our lab, we were one of the first labs that really started to notice that as you stop the boat and pick up this tire and let the water settle, you start to notice all this teeny tiny microplastic kind of float up out of the wake. And so it, doesn't make these beautiful, like, or ugly, I guess, stunning pictures of really thick trash. But you start to notice there is like all this tiny, tiny trash. And we started to realize what looked like blue water was actually full of kind of like confetti of plastic. So as you filter all of this water, a girl in my lab, Miriam Goldstein, who was really one of the pioneers of microplastics research, she counted 32,000 pieces of plastic in the Pacific Ocean, and she found that over 90% of them were smaller than an M&M. So this is small plastic. You can't really see it. It's very hard to clean up, but we actually realized that this plastic is a lot more harmful to the ocean because this small plastic is a lot easier to enter the food web. So like a huge tire can only really be eaten by a few very large animals, but tiny plastic the size of an M&M can be eaten by almost anything in the food web. And so why I have multiple sizes on here is now scientists now define microplastic as 5 millimeters, which is kind of half the size of an M&M. So you can think of it as like the size of a piece of confetti. That's what we define microplastic as now. But then all my research actually focused on really, really tiny microplastic, this size 333 micrometers, which is actually like so small, it's basically microscopic. And what we realized is that this tiny plastic is actually the size that goes through most nets. So it had kind of been really undercounted for most research. Early on microplastic research, we'd never really been counting it. And we realized that, that it's actually the vast majority of microplastic, but I didn't fully go on into that in this talk. But where this microplastic comes from is it comes from 4 main sources. So the first one is the one most people think of, which is fragments. So it's big plastic that breaks down into tiny things. They're fragments because they're kind of sharp edges, they're weird shapes. Sometimes you can tell what they used to be, like that they used to be a bottle cap or something. But in general, they're kind of irregular shapes. Then we're now starting to find more and more fibers in our samples. And so fibers are when you wash your clothes, what we think of as our clothes wearing out over time is actually fibers coming off of your clothes. Those fibers go out your washing machine, down the drain. They're too small to get filtered out at the wastewater treatment plant. And they go right out into whatever lake, river, or ocean you live nearest. And we're finding more and more of these microfibers. Then there's microbeads, which you may have heard of. Microbeads are the things that make your hand sanitizer or your toothpaste or your face wash look like it has confetti in it. These things are made out of plastic. They're also, you brush your teeth, you spit it out, they go down the drain, they're too small to get filtered out of the wastewater treatment plant, and they go right down the drain. We have banned these in America. They have not banned them in a lot of other countries. But the alternatives that people are still allowed to use in America, some of those are still forms of plastic. So we are still finding types of microbeads around in our samples. And then the last one, which some of Janis's pictures had, are these funny things called Nerdles, which they're these perfectly round pieces of plastic. And this is actually what plastic is made out of. So Nerdles are kind of the pre-production pellets of plastic. So they go from the plastic factory to the bottle factory. They get melted into bottles. Then those bottles go to the recycling plant. They get melted back down into Nerdles. Then they get recycled. Around and around they go. Nerdles are super cheap. They're super light. and they're super easy to lose. And so pretty much any beach or any harbor, you will find some if you look for about like 20 minutes. They're kind of everywhere. And then my last couple slides, and then I'll pass this to Tammy, is where do we find microplastics? So plastic is not one thing. So when you look on a piece of plastic and you see that recycling triangle with a number in it, that tells you what type of plastic it is. So some of those numbers float, and we find those pieces of plastic right at the surface. They're actually lighter than water. Those kinds of plastic float, and they interact with animals that eat at the surface, including seabirds. Some plastics are way heavier than water and they sink immediately, and we find those at the bottom. Those are by far the hardest to clean up, as you can imagine. And then some plastics are kind of the same density as water, or they are the plastics that float at the top, but as animals eat them and package them into fecal pellets, or they start to live on them and make them heavier and heavier, then you see them start to slowly sink. And sometimes they'll slowly sink because they're covered in algae or barnacles, but then an animal comes along and is like, oh, that algae tastes good, cleans it off. Then suddenly it's light again and it pops to the surface. And so you see these plastics kind of like float in the middle of the water column. But in general, you find plastic right at the surface and right at the bottom and just a little bit floating in the middle. Okay, those are just my basic slides. Then I'll let Tammy tell you more about what happens once animals interact with plastic. Let me stop sharing. There you go.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was awesome. And while Tammy gets her screen sharing going, I'm just going to mention that we thought we'd hold questions until after both of you have had a chance to share your information. So, and if anybody wants to post questions into the chat, feel free to do that, and we'll go over them after Tammy. Okay, Tammy, take it on.
Thanks, Jenny. We didn't really coordinate the transition, but I will say I think we did perfect because, oh, can I? There we go. Because my first slide is where are they? So let me go back to this one. So I'm just going to go over a little bit about how microplastics get into the food web and then the damage they can cause once they're in there. And then I'm going to talk about some research that I'm doing with plastics and penguins in Antarctica. So as Jenny mentioned, they can be found, and I'm going to focus just on microplastics. So they can be found along the surface, sink to the bottom, or within the water column, and can come back to shore. But where I'm focused on is this part, when they get eaten by animals. And so why are plastics a concern? I get asked this a lot, and microplastics are hydrophobic, which means that they repel water. And so they attract and accumulate molecules that are really similar to them, so that are also hydrophobic. And these include a lot of nasty contaminants like pesticides, BPA, which I know probably a lot of you buy bottles with no BPA right now. And then PCBs, which are used as in like coolants and things like that, and then flame retardants. And the big pesticide that's been banned in, I think it was 1972, DDT, is still being found on the surface of these microplastics. And so this is a really huge concern with the microplastics. It's not only that small organisms can ingest them and harm them from the sharp edges or accumulating in their gut, and they may starve, but it's these indirect effects from these contaminants. And so, like I said, in addition, some of these plastics have contaminants within them that they were used in their production, such as the BPAs, but then they also accumulate these contaminants on the surface. And as these accumulate within an individual species or animal, it can create negative impacts. So this accumulates and has impacts on their immune system, reproduction, a whole list of things, and could result in mortality. And so the way they get into the food web is they could be ingested directly from seawater. So I do research that has to do with krill. And so krill are just these big filter feeders. So they have these really complex appendages that they use to filter the water. And as they move through the water column, they congregate in these big swarms. And I just think of them as these big swarms of filtration that are just moving through the seawater, and they're eating plankton, single cell algae. And so as they're moving through eating this plankton, they're also able to ingest all of these small microplastics that fit in those intricate appendages. And so 2 words that you often hear when people talk about microplastics and food webs is bioaccumulation and biomagnification. And they mean similar but different things. And I really love this graphic. So bioaccumulation is within one individual. So in this one fish, over time, it accumulates whatever contaminant you're interested in, whether it's nano or microplastics or PCBs. So whatever that contaminant is, if it's increasing over time, it's that bioaccumulation in one individual. Whereas biomagnification is increased within the food web as you move from lower trophic animals, such as krill, and you move higher to humpback whales or the fish that eat them, and then the sea lions that eat those fish. And so every time you take a step in the food web to a higher trophic level, those contaminants biomagnify because they're eating more of that contaminant in each step of that food web. And so that's what I'm kind of the focus of this research that I'm interested in. And so for most of my talk, I'm just going to focus on what I'm doing in Antarctica. It's sad, but also an exciting area of research because we don't really know what's going on there. So I've been obsessed with Antarctica since I was a little kid. And we always think of images like this, right, where it's this pristine, untouched environment, no impacts from man. Although now, we know it's heavily impacted by climate change. But we hadn't really thought about the impacts of pollution like microplastics. It's far from populated areas. It does have fishing, but fishing isn't a huge source of microplastics. So I was really shocked to learn that they had been finding microplastics in the seawater all around the Antarctic Peninsula. And just to orient you, here's the peninsula, and the closest manned continent is South America, Chile and Argentina down at the bottom. And so this was a review that was done that looked at all microplastics or seawaters that had been sampled for microplastics. And in all of the seawater sampled around this peninsula, they found microplastics. And it wasn't just 1 or 2. In some cases, down here near Palmer Station, they were finding concentrations that were on par with what was being found in the North Pacific. So this was very concerning. I was alarmed. I wanted to figure out what was going on. Is this impacting the animals here? And so I work with NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's a Department of the Commerce. And so they have a few stations down in the South Shetland Islands. And so I've been working with researchers there. We've collected penguin guano. And this is just a view of what it's like at one of their field camps. Here's a camera so they can monitor how many nests and how many chicks These are Gen 2 penguins, and here you can see a chick. There's a parent and a chick at the nest, a few of them. So they have long-term research that looks at the populations of penguins and fur seals and other organisms at these field camps. And all of this pink you can see is penguin guano or penguin poop, and they eat mostly krill. And so I thought, well, this is a perfect opportunity to collect this penguin guano and see if we're finding microplastics in their diet. So my research is focused on 2 species of penguin. Adelie here, they eat almost all krill, all Antarctic krill, which are these large, very fatty krill, very nutritious. Gen 2, they're called a generalist species. So they eat krill, fish, squid. So they're more flexible in their diet. And so the Adelie penguins eat from the bottom of the food chain, they eat these krill. And Gen 2 penguins eat, at the bottom was krill, but then a step up with fish and squid. So my hypothesis was that Gen 2 penguins would be exposed to more microplastics. And here's just a schematic to visualize this. We have Antarctic krill, the base of the food web, and then Adelie just eat those. So that's just one step in the food chain. And Gen 2 penguins, here's the second step. So some biomagnification from fish to Gen 2. At least that's my hypothesis. And Jenny and I are going to be processing these samples with some other researchers this winter. So we'll be able to figure it out if my hypothesis stands or if we find microplastics in their diet at all. So I just wanted to kind of show all of you kind of the general steps on what we do. This is my colleague Jefferson collecting penguin guano in Antarctica. He was pretty thrilled about that, as you can see. And then the steps in the lab is that we break down any biological material that's in the sample. We filter that, and then we're using a different type of microscope and this really cool spectrometer. We can see how many microplastics and what type we're finding. And then this spectrometer can tell you what kind of polymer it is. So actually what kind of plastic we're finding. And here's just an example. This is under that microscope. It shines this fluorescent light, and microplastic or plastics will fluoresce. So you could see some fibers here like Jenny was talking about, some little microplastic particles here maybe. And then this last step is that we're going to analyze the sample for DNA, and we can see samples that contained fish. All of them will contain krill, but the samples that contain fish, we hypothesize that we'll find more plastics there. And so this will really give us insight into how the microplastics get from seawater into the food web, and kind of the dynamics of how it's moving through that food web, and if biomagnification is occurring in the Antarctic food web. And the big, broader significance of this is that these species are already under massive threat from climate change. This area is one of the fastest warming regions in the world, just dramatic. 2 years ago, it was warmer there than it was in La Jolla in the same day. It was crazy. So identifying what species are under extreme threat from climate change, but also which ones are like disproportionately impacted from these microplastics. And it'll really inform like where do our conservation efforts need to focus on. And it'll determine as well, because microplastics and plastic production, they're increasing. So as that increases, understanding how this is moving through the food web, both of those things will be able to understand how this may impact the ecosystem in the future. And with that, like to thank you all for having us. You can email me with any questions. And then I post on my Instagram updates on all of this research, so you can follow along. Thank you. Oh, you're muted, Janice.
Thank you, thank you. So fascinating from both of you. And we do have a question in the chat. If anyone else has questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat. But I have a question for you, Tammy. I was introduced to you by someone who was volunteering here locally with the Seabird project. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, yes, I would be happy to talk about that. So I'm a volunteer coordinator for U.S. Fish and Wildlife. I started seabird surveys and marine mammal surveys of beaches all along San Diego. So we survey from Carlsbad down to Imperial Beach, which is heavily impacted by the Tijuana estuary. And we survey the beaches once a month for beached birds and marine mammals. And I have a permit with NOAA to collect carcasses, and once things open back up, NOAA is not open right now. So once that lab opens back up, I'll be looking at the gut contents of all of these animals and seeing locally how much plastics, large plastics and microplastics are we finding in these dead seabirds that are washing ashore. And at least in La Jolla, right where Scripps is, we've been seeing mass die-offs every year and the species has been changing. So it's going to be very interesting what we're finding. And there's some other researchers at Scripps that are looking at the diet of these animals, or the availability of their prey, and seeing if that may be causing it. But really, we won't know until we open them up. And sorry if that sounds graphic, but
as gruesome as that, yeah, as gruesome as that sounds, thank you for doing that work, because I think that people think of this as being a problem in far off places like the Antarctic, which is concerning to us, but we also have to realize that it's happening here locally as well. A general question that came in was from about Nerdles and how often Nerdles can be recycled, or how often, I guess, what Nerdles are turned into also can be recycled. And you kind of touched on that, Jenny, when you mentioned the recycling number and the types of plastic. And
yeah, so it depends the type of plastic, but you can only recycle plastic a couple times, so like 3 to 5 times, whereas some things like aluminum or glass are infinitely recyclable. You can truly recycle glass forever, and it doesn't really decrease in value or strength, which is why one, those things are actually more valuable to recycling companies, but also why they're kind of what a lot of zero waste and sustainability companies like always are encouraging. But yeah, so plastic, it does depend the type of plastic. Like PET is more durable. You can recycle it more often than some of the other types of plastic, but you still can't recycle plastic that many times, which is a shame. It just loses a lot of its strength and durability, at least with the current recycling technology we have.
And I think that even a recycled product has some virgin plastic in it, because it's really difficult to make something out of 100% recycled plastic. Is that right?
No, now we can make it out of 100% recycled plastic. It's come a long way in just the last like 5 years. But they can do it that way, where they add in a little bit of virgin plastic and then it keeps it always like a little bit stronger. But yeah, our PET can be 100% recycled PET. But yeah, I went to a recycling conference earlier this year, and it was honestly one of the more encouraging things I've done in a long time. Just the amount of technology that is actually going into trying to recycle plastic for the first time in a long time. And some of that is truly that China has just taken our plastic for 30 years. And so America hasn't really invested in the infrastructure or the technology to make our recycling better. And now that China isn't taking our recycling, America is finally like, oh, maybe we should, modernize this facility that we haven't modernized since 1985. And they're making some huge leaps and bounds. So I actually wouldn't be surprised if our recycling facilities catch up soon. But yeah, right now our recycling systems are leave a lot to be desired. It's not the solution by any means to our problem.
Another question, this one's from Addie, is what is the most surprising thing each of you have found or discovered as a result of your science practice research regarding microplastics? Has there been one thing that's just totally surprised you?
Yeah, I can go. Janis pointed to it a little bit in her intro of me, and then I didn't talk about it, but I looked at sediment cores off the coast of Santa Barbara, which is a very unique location in terms of sediment. So in a lot of places, when you look at sediment, there's a lot of things like living in the sediment and animals and crabs and all kinds of stuff. So as the sediment falls from like the surface ocean, it all just gets kind of like mixed up in what we call bioturbated. And so then once you go back and look at the sediment core, every layer in the sediment core represents like 50 years or 100 years, because that sediment has just kind of gotten mixed up over time, and we call it like fluffy sediment. Well, in Santa Barbara, the very bottom of the ocean actually has no oxygen. It's called anoxic. And so there's no animals that live right in the Santa Barbara basin between Santa Barbara and the Channel Islands. And so as the sediment falls, it's not disturbed at all. It truly falls perfectly onto the bottom of the ocean in these perfect yearly layers. And it literally is like you're cutting into tree rings. And so you know exactly what happened in the ocean above you, going back like 350 years before you even have to like correct for any compression of the sediment or anything. You can just kind of count with your fingers of like what year was in the sediment. And so I did this and looked at microplastic in the sediment, and I found this exponential increase in the amount of sediment or amount of microplastic we left behind in the sediments starting in 1945 and kind of going in this exponential increase. And it perfectly matched or perfectly correlated with that exponential increase I showed you in worldwide plastic production since 1945. And so really what this shows us is like, as we're making more and more plastic on land, it's actually getting out into the ocean, into our sediment, which will become our fossil record. And so that was kind of just one of those shocking moments of like, oh, we are truly impacting our environment. And we have the potential to, like if you go back way to like middle school, when you learned about like the Iron Age and the Bronze Age and like all those things, like we have the potential to be known as like the plastic age in like future years. And so it was just kind of one of those moments when I first graphed it on paper that I was like, oh my gosh, this is not good. And yeah, so that was kind of the most shocking thing I think I've ever found. And you'll just have those moments sometimes as a scientist where you like think you're onto something, and then when you first graph it on paper, you're like, oh yeah, it really is kind of what I thought it was going to be. So that was it for me.
And that's something as an artist, and my sister is an artist that has worked with plastic pollution for a long time as well. And that's something that they had theorized about just as artists, like they had done this graphic of a cliffside and then had imposed a layer of plastic within it to show that era that we're living in. And they were just playing around with that idea. But here, as you've discovered, it's actually what we're going to be leaving behind. That's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Tammy? Has there been a specific aha for you?
Yeah, I think I'm sure I'll have another one after we analyze these samples. But for me so far was just that reading that publication of the microplastic concentration in seawater around Antarctica was really, I mean, I love Antarctica with passion. And understanding that, like, okay, now it's being hit on this front as well was really devastating for me. But I think scientifically it was also very interesting because people had used ocean models to look at particle transport to Antarctica. And there were studies published that, you know, all the microplastics found there were hypothesized to be from local sources, so tourist ships or researchers, but we're finding it at such a level that it has to come from long-term or long distance transport. So it kind of went against what people had hypothesized. And I think that's always interesting when that happens, because that means, okay, there's still questions. We don't know everything. We got to look into this further. And just being involved in microplastic research, I'm on the working group for the UN Southern Ocean Decade. And so this decade is dedicated to understanding what are the research priorities in the Southern Ocean, what are those unknowns? And we don't know a lot about microplastics in Antarctica. And so we don't know the concentrations in most of the regions around Antarctica. The peninsula is really the one of the few places that's visited regularly. And we don't know what's going on in the food web. So just finding out that it's this big black box that we need to figure out what are the components before understanding how those components work. That was really interesting and shocking.
And just this thought that these pristine remote places that we think of as being untouched by humans are actually being impacted by us, from the bottom of the seafloor to Antarctica to the top of the highest peaks around the world. Anna Marie had another question. She's from Chile, actually. And in one of your, let's see, saw the coast of Chile as an area of high density of microplastics, and she's wondering why that might be. And in Chile, they have actually passed laws that prohibit the use of plastic bags in stores. So any insight on Chile?
The map that I showed may have been a little bit deceiving. I can reshare it. So this right here is the South Shetland Islands. So it's right here. So the map isn't the same proportions. I haven't looked at what they're finding along the coast of Chile. So I'm not sure what's going on off of the coast there, but I would imagine even with the ban on plastic bags that they're still finding microplastics there because they come from so many different things that are made out of plastics.
Yeah, one of the things we find, which is really sad sometimes, is that it's actually like, it's not all local plastic, like Tammy's saying. I mean, no one lives in Antarctica and we find plastic, and Hawaii has some of the strictest laws on plastic in the world, but they have some of the most polluted beaches. And so sometimes the plastic is coming from very far away from where you live. But some beaches are what we call source beaches, where like the plastic is coming from right where you are. And then some places are what we call sink beaches, where it's like the currents are pushing the plastic onto your beaches, even if it's not really your own plastic. So there's a lot of studies that go on where countries kind of pay to find out if they're source or sink beaches, because they want to say it's not really their fault. And then sometimes we're like, sorry, Australia, some of your plastic is your fault. You're not like a full sink country, like continent. Some of it is you guys. But yeah, it's just really interesting that some places, you know, like rural Alaska along the Aleutian Islands, where almost no one lives, is some of the most polluted coastline in the world because of just like where the currents push the plastic. So it's not very fair where the plastic ends up.
And like you showed in that one image, the Hawaiian Islands are kind of right there in the middle of the Pacific garbage patch, right? And I know Camilo Beach, which is on the Big Island, is really impacted by the currents and how the plastic from the patch washes up there.
Yeah, and I think because they have such polluted beaches, people in Hawaii are really passionate about plastic pollution, and they've passed really restrictive laws, but that doesn't mean plastic from other places isn't going to keep washing up there. So yeah, it's a lot of Pacific Islands bear the brunt of it. It's really hard.
I'm checking in the chat to see if I missed any questions. Oh, someone did mention the recent oil spill. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so the tar balls that have been being found, I think like at Black's Beach and La Jolla and others, has started showing up before the oil spill. I don't know any more about that. I know people are recording what's been washing up, and my surveys have increased. Me and my volunteers and I have been doing at least twice monthly surveys right now to see if we're seeing any repercussions down here in San Diego from this oil spill, because I know oil birds are coming to shore up north. So we're keeping an eye on things on the bird front, but I know that the tar balls that were washing up were before the oil spill, and that's something that we don't really experience down here. I know up north that's something that kind of naturally occurs and washes ashore, but yeah, it would be nice to get some more insights on that. So hopefully some researchers are looking into that. I know it's being monitored.
As somebody who cleans the beach regularly and has done so for a long time, I've seen tar on the beaches over the course of the years. What I've seen recently since that oil spill seems a little bit different in consistency. So I'm wondering if could be from the spill or not. No way to know unless.
Yeah, I think there are people that have been collecting samples since the spill though. So hopefully we'll figure something out. But yeah, I'm not involved in that. Just on the bird front.
I think Coast Keeper is collecting samples, and if you find tar balls, I think you can report them to San Diego Coast Keeper.
Let's see. I don't see any other questions in the chat. If anybody has any last thoughts, go ahead and throw them in there. We're almost out of time. I so appreciate this conversation. So interesting. As somebody who's read a lot on this topic and has thought about it a lot, it's so insightful to hear from you. I do have one last question myself because I'm an educator, and I think that we need more girls in the sciences. And I'm wondering what sparked you, and I heard from you, Tammy, that you've always loved Antarctica, but is there something as an educator that we can do to encourage more women to enter the field?
Yeah, that is a great question. I don't know. I mean, I think it's definitely something we're talking a lot more about than when I started in grad school and in my undergrad career. So that is really great, I think. But I think just like engaging girls younger is always helpful. Like whether that's going to talk to middle schoolers or like I try to, whenever like Girl Scouts ask me to come talk or things like that, like young groups of girls, just like showing them like what it looks like to have a career in the sciences is really important to me.
I think they don't see women represented in the sciences as a whole, so then they can't envision themselves doing that. So the more women like yourselves are out there, I think the more encouraging it'll be to more youth.
I think that's really true. It's not modeled very often.
That's kind of my take on that. I grew up in very in farmland, I didn't know, like, I had never met a scientist. I didn't know how people became scientists. I just knew I loved Antarctica and I loved seabirds, which is a really weird thing to know as a little kid.
Especially
But,
as someone who lived on a farm as a kid.
Yeah. So it took me a really long time to figure out how to get there. I mean, I'm an older student and it took me a really long time, and it was a lot of hurdles and it was a lot of messing up and figuring out how to get there. And so I think, and along with Jenny said, you know, I try to talk to young people as much as I can and tell them my backstory. Be like, I grew up on a farm. I didn't know scientists, you know, and then explaining what a PhD is. A lot of people don't know what a PhD is, or that in science, a lot of them are paid positions, which instantly makes it more accessible to people. And would I have known that as a kid, I would have gone straight to the PhD path. So I think explaining logistics is super important for kids to understand how it actually works. And not just the exposure to a female scientist, but that path is open to them. So I think that's really critical. And then also something that I try to remind myself is that I had really important, valuable, life-changing mentors that kept bugging me right throughout my journey and checking in with me. And so every time I mentor someone, it's not only this one-time event, but the check-ins afterwards to help them progress. And I think that's also something that's kind of looked over a lot of times. It's like, do these mentoring positions and then you're done. You can, you know, check that off. But it's the long-term help that people need through different steps of the journey. I think those are just my 2 cents that I've learned over, you know, my experience.
I love that. And that's inspirational to me as an educator. And as we wrap up, I just want to acknowledge that the Hill Street Country Club does this work and with youth and underrepresented communities, and Addie and her reuse project and working with the students at Cal State San Marcos and beyond, that we can all lift each other up and give each other hope and inspiration and feel empowered to make a difference, whether it's through the sciences or through the arts or through whatever means speaks to anyone, that we can help each other along that path. So thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. I appreciate it so much. And thanks for everybody who's in the recording, and so that we can spread this beyond our conversation here. So
Yeah,
with
thanks
that,
for having us.
Yeah, thanks
thank
for having
you.